It is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Isabel Sickenberger. She's research associate at the chair of philosophical anthropology and philosophy of mind at the University of Potsdam. Her main research interests lie in Post-Kantian philosophy, especially German idealism and Hegel, philosophy of mind, social philosophy, and critical theory. She's working on a dissertation titled Lebendiges Selbstbewusstsein, Hegel über die selbstbewusste Form menschlichen Lebens, where she tackles the question of the form of spiritual life. Her talk today is entitled Freedom's Discontent, Hegel on the Division of Labor and Gender. Isabel, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elena. Okay, you already heard the... Sorry? Oh, it's not... Okay, great. So you already heard the title of my talk, and I'm very excited to be able to present in this context. And I just want to say before I start, it's more like a work in progress and kind of preliminary, which is why I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and any kind of critical objections, comments, queries, and so on. So I just jump in and start with my introduction. Hegel's understanding of freedom is usually characterized as social freedom because Hegel is not simply concerned with the realization of individual freedom of will or moral freedom, but with a more complex understanding of freedom that emphasizes the extent to which free self-determination, social dependence, and social determination on others must necessarily be intertwined. In the philosophy of right, he says that, I quote, "The activity of the will consists in sublating the contradiction between subjectivity and objectivity and in translating its ends from their subjective determination into an objective one, while at the same time remaining with itself in this objectivity." End of quote. Friedrich Neuhauser describes the two dimensions of freedom expressed therein as subjective and objective dimensions, in the form of rational laws and institutions, such as the family, civil society, and the state. Sittlichkeit is realized as objective freedom, at least partially independent of the subjective attitudes and dispositions of its social members. Sittlichkeit insofar realizes a self-determined whole that reproduces itself through functionally specific institutions. At the same time, the rational institutions of modern Sittlichkeit are precisely those institutions that first and foremost enable individuals to realize themselves as bearers of self-determined wills in the real world and thereby realizes the individual and social freedom of its members. Individual social freedom, therefore, is an achievement brought about by diverse educational processes in the social spheres of Sittlichkeit, especially within the family and the division of labor in civil society, which enables subjects social participation, develop their abilities, and lead a self-determined life. Social freedom for Hegel means to highlight that we are living in social relationships that do not simply appear to us as the other, and therefore is, as Robert Pippin says, a social achievement. This is why Robert Pippin emphasizes that the distinction between nature and the realm of laws and spirit as the realm of freedom is not an ontological fact of matter. Although Hegel's social freedom emphasizes that freedom is not a product of hyper-individualistic self-determination, but is embedded in dependencies upon others and the social dimension of human existence, there remains a sense of discontent. This is not certain, Is it not certain structural elements of modern Sittlichkeit, which Hegel regards as a prerequisite for the realization of social freedom, that stand as an obstacle to the concrete realization of social freedom itself? In the following, I would like to pursue two dimensions of freedom's discontent: the division of labor and the gendered division of labor within civil society. I will proceed in 3 steps. First, I will reconstruct Hegel's account of the division of labor in his System der Sittlichkeit and the Jena lectures of 1805 and 06. Hegel here seems to be perfectly clear about the ambivalence of progress and the destructive potential of the specific relations of production and the division of labor within civil society. Hegel sees the dual movement between the ever-increasing division of labor and the human labor it transforms, and technical progress not as an abstract necessity, but as a movement of human progress itself. At the same time, he is aware of the destructive effects of the relations of production. The specifically capitalist division of labor and mode of production undermines the dexterity of the workers and at the same time threatens the physical reproduction and survival of the working class. Interestingly, however, Hegel recognizes that the destructive side is not simply a defect of the capitalist relations of production that could easily be eliminated in order to get a good and ambivalent free capitalist relation of production, but a problem whose cause lies in the historical, concrete way civil society is organized. Secondly, I will take the connection between self-determination and social dependence in Hegel's treatment of the family in the philosophy of right and the contradiction between the family and civil society into view. Hegel in the philosophy of right seems to be similarly clear, albeit less explicit, with regard to the gender-specific division of labor within civil society. On the one hand, Hegel seems to see clearly that the gender division of labor is accompanied by a restriction of women to a certain sphere of Sittlichkeit, which at the same time makes women economically vulnerable. However, he cannot identify this restriction as a relationship of domination and must justify it so that reproductive labor, which is necessary for the sphere of production relations in civil society, is maintained. The reason lies in the contradiction between the family and civil society. I will close by briefly turning to Marx and ask to what extent Marx, although in an undeveloped sense, is aware of the connection between the relations of production in civil society and of reproductive labor in the family. That was only implicit in Hegel's account of Sittlichkeit. Okay, I start with the first part, the division of labor in Hegel's System der Sittlichkeit. In the System der Sittlichkeit, Hegel developed for the first time a theory of what he would later call the objective spirit. As is well known, Hegel did not develop a self-standing theory of economics, but treated economic considerations as part of his social philosophy. It is therefore not surprising that Hegel's philosophy of right is usually referred to when discussing his political philosophy and economic issues. However, Hegel developed his views on economics first and perhaps most detailed in his System der Sittlichkeit. In the System der Sittlichkeit, Hegel examines the conditions and social binding forces that allow the individual to identify with the social totality. At the same time, it aims to show how the inviolability of the individual's personality is to be preserved and thus protected from isolation and alienation in order to ensure the full realization of social freedom. It is, of course, not my intention to offer a comprehensive interpretation of this very complicated text. Rather, I will concentrate on a certain aspect and work out a particular figure, namely the ambivalence in the division of labor. In order to do so, I will follow Georg Lukács as he emphasized some very revealing insights with regard to the question in his work on the young Hegel. In the philosophy of right, Hegel characterizes labor in the chapter on the civil society as an intentional activity that mediates between needs and the means for their satisfaction. Since Hegel initially seems to have essentially so-called natural needs in mind when talking about needs, it could look like as if human labor consists in creating means for natural needs, wherefore labor is to be understood as a mediation between nature and culture. What is crucial is to emphasize that needs for Hegel are not simply natural needs in any immediate sense, but also transformed and brought about by social forces. The significance of labor is not limited to the fact that as an individual activity, it mediates the natural immediate needs of an individual with nature, but has a substantial social dimension. It has therefore at the same time a universal and objective dimension. In the System der Sittlichkeit, Hegel describes how the universal and objective dimensions of labor consists in two elements: the social division of labor and the form of market economy related to the division of labor. Here Hegel writes, "No one is responsible for the totality of his need for itself. His labor or whatever means of satisfying his need does not secure it for him. It is an alien power over which he can do nothing, on which it depends whether the abundance which he possesses is for him a totality of satisfaction. The value of it, that which expresses the relation of abundance to need, is independent of him and changeable. Insofar as labor not longer ensures the direct satisfaction of subjective needs, the so-called system of needs becomes, as Hegel calls it, a system of universal mutual physical dependence on each other. In the same passage, Hegel goes on to say that the value itself depends on the whole of needs and the whole of affluence, and this whole is a barely recognizable, invisible, and incalculable power that is unberechenbare Kraft. The whole becomes an incalculable power since this system quantitatively comprises a sum of an infinite number of Einzelnheit and is qualitatively composed of infinitely different needs that the social division of labor inevitably develops in an unplanned way. That the value of labor and its products is not determined by the individual but depends on the whole of needs and the whole of abundance means that the balance between supply and demand is thus determined by the market economy, but because this is dependent on various random factors, the value of labor products is changeable. In order to understand why labor has a socially formative function for Hegel, two further aspects must be emphasized. Firstly, the double dialectical movement that Hegel demonstrates in labor. Lukács emphasizes that for Hegel natural laws are at work in the object of labor, which is why labor can only become fruitful on the basis of knowledge of these laws. At the same time, the object becomes a different one through the work. The form of the object is annihilated and a new form is produced. Although the transformation of form is the result of labor, the transformation of form is based on the recognition of the inherent law of the object. This dialectic in the object corresponds to a dialectic in the subject. In labor, the human being becomes a thing and alienates himself from himself. The objective inherent lawfulness of labor is independent of the desires and inclinations of the individual. It is only through labor that something general arises in the human being, a break with the instinctive occurs. The immediate satisfaction of need is the simple destruction of the object, while labor is its transformation. And then it says, only when humans interpose labor between their desires and their satisfaction, the human being becomes human. Secondly, the aspect of being directly recognized in social labor must be emphasized. This aspect becomes particularly clear in the lecture manuscripts from 1805 and 06. Here we can read, being recognized is immediately actuality and in its element the person, first as being for itself in general, it is enjoying and working. Only here does desire have the right to appear, for it is actual, it itself has a universal spiritual being. Labor of all, for all, and pleasure of all, each serves the other and provides help, end of quote. Through the social division of labor, each individual works for a need so that respective content of labor goes beyond the satisfaction of one's own need and contributes to the satisfaction of the needs of all. Labor becomes abstract as the work of the individual is no longer directly related to the individual satisfaction of needs, but rather produces exchange values. Hegel at the same time states that the relationship of the individual to its particular needs is to a certain extent restored by the fact that the products of labor acquire a general socially recognized value in the exchange relationship that can be expressed in money, which simplifies the exchange of goods. For Hegel, this movement of labor expresses the context of being recognized. In its recognition, labor takes on an essentially social dimension in a system of mutual dependencies, which is expressed in the social division of labor and the market and exchange relationship that regulates the distribution of goods. In the lecture manuscript, we can read, the universalist value, the movement as sense is exchange. The same universality is mediation as knowing movement. Property, thus an immediate having, which is mediated by being recognized, or is its existence, Dasein, is the spiritual being. Here the contingency of taking possession is abolished. I have everything through labor and through exchange in being recognized, end of quote. Decisive for Hegel's theory of labor, however, is the reception of Adam Smith's national economics. In his discussion of national economics, Hegel, on the one hand, gains insight into the massive increase in productivity made possible by industrial society, which Hegel discusses, for example, following Smith on the basis of the production of the pin. He emphasizes the connection between the social division of labor, the human labor transformed by it, and the technical progress that is evident in the necessity of using machines. Hegel presents this movement objectively as the necessary movement of human progress. On the other hand, Hegel is totally clear that the realization of the modern Sittlichkeit through labor goes hand in hand with the possibility of its degradation. The problematic aspect of labor is related to its social nature and is therefore unavoidable. The universal dependence of humans on humans expressed in social labor, while it asserts the general nature of humans, at the same time generates a power that rules over them and evades their control, because what is produced under these conditions are not objects of their immediate need, but commodities. Hegel emphasizes a necessary dialectic connection between social progress and the division of labor on the one hand, and the destructive potential on the other, and sees this as two sides of the specific mode of production in civil society. Hegel himself focuses in particular on two dimensions of these destructive potential of the social division of labor. First, the consequences of the division of labor in the factory are that the social recognition of workers is destroyed. The workers' skills are restricted in the increasingly mechanized production process. The socially recognized quality of craftsmanship is lost and the work becomes something mechanical. The worker's labor power is reduced to his physical strength to drive the machines. Hegel writes, since his labor is the abstract, he behaves as an abstract I, or after the manner of Dingheit. Second, the worker loses his social recognition because he cannot secure his existence and the reproduction of his labor power independently by selling the products of his labor, and is subject to the random law of the market because both supply and demand are subject to changes that cannot be completely controlled by either the companies or the state. As a result, the class of factory workers is exposed to poverty, unable to help itself through its own professional expertise. Hegel is clear that the most powerful force is the commodity-producing society. Hegel is clear that the most powerful force in the commodity-producing society is the power of the market. The power of the market is linked to the transformation of the use value of objects into the exchange value of commodities. Human labor, which originally served the purpose of gaining the recognition of others, and power over objects ultimately places human beings in the diametrically opposed position of extreme dependence and complete disempowerment in the face of those powers that were generated by them in their own subjectivity, but over which they have now lost all control. In this context, Hegel speaks pointedly about aspects of class rule when he formulates the insight that the wealth of nations can only be achieved at the price of the poverty of entire classes. He writes, factories, manufactories build their existence precisely on the misery of one class. Hegel comes to the conclusion that wealth and poverty are independent and representations of two aspects of the opposing forces that are immanent in the market of civil society. Of course, Hegel emphasizes that society in general and state power in particular must ensure that one's existence is maintained and must counteract both destructive tendencies as effectively as possible. In the lecture manuscript from 1803-04, Hegel writes that balance must be established similar to a wild animal that requires eternal strict control and taming. Hegel at the same time is recognizing that this cannot prevent the working class from being abandoned to poverty. The reason for this lies in Hegel's insight that any intervention is merely external to the economy, which is why he describes the field of the economy as the field of arbitrariness, and demands that any intervention must be as inconspicuous as possible. Consequently, the stately regulations and laws cannot abolish the necessary dialectic of the capital division of labor. There's only the necessity to limit the destructive aspects temporally, tentatively, and continuously. Following Hegel's thoughts on the nature of modern commodity-producing societies, we could find it just consequent that Hegel would now argue in favor of a radical transformation of that society. However, precisely at that point where Hegel exposes modern society as a system that plunges entire masses of people into misery, the possibility of a radical transformation of society is rejected. This possibility remains only, as Hegel says, an inner indignation, not an outward act. When Hegel wrote The Philosophy of Right, later it seems as if he is conceived that he had already found the solution to this problem, which led to the critique appearing as something secondary, while the proposed solution moved to the center of the argument. The state is presented as a force that regulates and integrates economic activity. The state must intervene in the free play of the market forces in order to guarantee a minimum standard of living to which every individual has a right, insofar as the automatic regulatory mechanisms of the market are not sufficient to do so. The state then must intervene by means of taxation and price control. I cannot go into detail with regard to Hegel's solution in the Philosophy of Right, but what is crucial here is that in the System der Sittlichkeit, the state seems to be just an external force that intervenes in the inner market dynamics. I come to the second part of my talk, the family and the gender division of labor. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel explains the division of gender through the example of Antigone and Creon. While Antigone represents the sphere of the hearth, of the family, of kinship, and of the nether world, Creon represents the law for the city and the politics that are of this world. Women are perceived as representing the principles of particularity, immediacy, and feeling, while men represent the principle of universality, freedom, and subjectivity. However, there's a place in the Hegel system where the mere opposition of gender division is to be overcome, and their unity is to be realized, namely in marriage and the family. Here Hegel writes, so this is now of the Philosophy of Right. Marriage at the immediate sittliche relationship contains first the moment of natural vitality, and since it is a substantial relationship, this involves life in its totality, namely as the actuality of the Gattung and its process. But second, in self-consciousness, the unity of this natural sexes, which was merely inward or had being only in itself, and whose existence was for this very reason a merely external, is transformed into a spiritual union, into self-conscious love. End of quote. In contract, for example, in abstract right, individuals remain separate and sufficient for themselves, while in the family relationship they become a union in the sense of one person, and the family members become its accidents. Given the general structure of Hegel's thought, it seems that the family is a point of dialectic sublation of gender difference. At the same time, Hegel formulates his account of the gender division of labor with regard to the family. That means marriage, as Andrea Novakovic points out, I quote, does not just take sexual difference at the face value, but justifies and transforms any natural differences between the sexes, end of quote. The sexual difference, therefore, is no longer a brute fact that human beings and animals share. It appears, moreover, under a distinctly ethical interpretation. How the story unfolds is well known. The young male enters the next stage of Sittlichkeit, civil society, becomes a citizen, participates in public life, becomes involved in the market, and represents the family within civil society. The sphere of woman, however, is essentially marriage and the family, and the sphere of care and reproductive labor. One reason for Hegel's account of the necessity of gender division of labor is, as Terry Pinkard points out, that, I quote, whenever Hegel understands some social function to be necessary to a form of life's continuance and maintenance, he tends to look for discrete job holders for those functions, end of quote. In the following, I cannot go into detail how Hegel justifies the division of gender. My aim is to show that Hegel implicitly recognizes a contradiction between the family and the sphere of reproduction and care, and civil society as the sphere of the market and labor division that arises from the concrete conditions of modern Sittlichkeit itself. Since the family is a moment of the sphere of Sittlichkeit, Hegel understands the family as a moment of the unfolding of the free will. Hegel at the same time is not presupposing the free will of the family members, but rather shows how the individuals experience their independence and dependence on each other. That is, at the quote before, or what the quote before states, the actuality of the Gattung and its process. Karen Ing and Thomas Kurana, among others, have recently worked out what it means to recognize oneself as a Gattungswesen. With regard to the family, one aspect is crucial that can be expressed with Thomas Kurana as follows, I quote, "As Gattungswesen, the human being can only realize itself by relating to its social others in a special way. The other functions as a mediator between me and my Gattung. Only in an other, to whom I am related in a specific way, is the course of my life. Is my Gattung objectified, and only through this relation to another am I a Gattungswesen," end of quote. That the individuals, according to Hegel, experience the actuality of the Gattung and its process within the family relationship means nothing other than they do not exist in it as independent entities, but as mere moments of this subordinate context. In the family, the individuals are aware of it in an equally natural and immediate form that Hegel calls the feeling of love. That the individuals give up their independence within family relationship is crucial and makes this sphere essentially different from that of abstract right, the first part of the philosophy of right with which the development of the free will begins. Here, the independence of the person is the first and abstract, merely presupposed expression of freedom of the individual. With this presupposition, individuals are thought of as merely self-standing, constituted individuals and therefore abstracted from their Gattung and its Gattungszusammenhang. As the partners give up their independence as persons within the family, Hegel against Kant emphasizes that marriage, like the state, is no contractual relationship of independent individuals. It is important that Hegel is concerned here with a movement of appropriation. The individual cannot be presupposed as being independent and self-standing, but must rather develop an independence towards its dependency, which is then the result of the movement and not its precondition. While the family context allows the individual to experience pure independence at the level of civil society, it can experience an independence that is no longer merely abstract. Although it is the young male who enters the next stage of Sittlichkeit, namely civil society, woman must at least be granted the possibility of independence, because only in this way can it be understood that it means that women, like men, give up their personal independence when she consents to enter the family relationship through marriage. Both individuals should therefore have equal rights within the family context and share equally rights in family property. Due to the different social conditions of man and woman, however, the equality that Hegel claims with regard to the family relationship turns into a relationship of inequality, because only the male enters the sphere of civil society and represents the family legally. The movement of appropriation between independence and dependence described by Hegel emphasizes, on the one hand, the importance of the family context, on the other, the necessity of emancipation from the relationship of dependence existing in the family, that is the necessary transition to civil society. It is precisely at this point that the gender division of labor manifests itself for Hegel. Here he writes, "The one sex is therefore spirituality, which divides itself up into personal self-sufficiency with being for itself and the knowledge of and volition of free universality into the self-consciousness of conceptual thought and the volition of the objective and ultimate end. And the other is spirituality, which maintains itself in unity as knowledge and volition and the substantial in the form of concrete individuality, Einzelheit, and feeling, Empfindung. In its external relations, the former is powerful and active, the latter passive and subjective. Man therefore has his actual substantial life in the state, in learning, Wissenschaft, etc., and otherwise in work and struggle with the external world and with himself, so that it is only through the division that he fights his way to self-sufficient unity with himself. In the family, he has a peaceful intuition of this unity and an emotive empfindend and subjective Sittlichkeit. Woman, however, has her substantial vocation, her Bestimmung in the family, and her ethical disposition consists in this family piety. End of quote. Hegel's justification of the gender division of labor has led to a range of criticisms on the one hand, and to the defense of Hegel on the other hand, by arguing that his justification of gender division of labor and the downgrade of woman contradict his broader system, as for example that the familial role of woman conflicts with Hegel's attribution to woman of civil personality and modern agency. What is important, however, is rather Hegel's underlying insight that within modern Sittlichkeit, the family and civil society are two fundamentally contradictory principles which are distributed precisely because they contradict each other and therefore need to be represented by the gender division of labor. The principle of the unity as the sphere of care and reproduction is the subordination of the individual to the universal of the family. The principle of civil society is the sphere of the market and the production process, where the individual is independent and self-standing. Hegel emphasizes that for the male who is active in civil society, it is important to recognize himself as an independent person and as a moment of the universality of the state. The male, as the quote above just stated, has his actual substantial life in the state, as Hegel says, in der Wissenschaft, and otherwise in work and struggle with the external world and with himself, so that it is only through his division that he fights his way to self-sufficient unity with himself. The family, which represents the principle of the state that is dependency, but in an immediate way. So this is why Hegel says that in the family, he, the male, has a peaceful intuition of this unity and an emotive and subjective Sittlichkeit. This means that the family context functions as the context of meaning to the male that reflects the meaningfulness of his labor and at the same time secures his reproduction and serves as the space of care. This means that on the one hand, he understands the social whole as the realization of himself through work in the sense of the society-forming function, and at the same time understands himself as a Gattungswesen in the state. The family, the woman, and the sphere of reproductive and care labor, on the other hand, provides the basis and prerequisite for the male to realize himself in the civil society and in the state. If Hegel is right that the family and civil society are two contradictory spheres within Sittlichkeit, and that there must therefore be a distribution of roles based on the division of gender, two challenges arise. First, in order for the family to form the basis of prerequisite for civil society and to fulfill its requirements satisfactorily, Hegel must show to what extent the state can succeed in mediating both spheres and protecting the family against civil society. Nevertheless, the family only exists within civil society and is necessarily permeated by its determinations. Civil society as sphere of production seems to be the primary determinant of the family on the one hand, and on society as a whole on the other. The functioning of social relations of care and reproductive labor, therefore, is at least to a certain extent controlled by the dictates of the market. Secondly, if the contradiction between the family and civil society is the product of modern Sittlichkeit and its relations themselves, the problem of the gender division of labor can neither be solved by reversing the gender division, nor by simply opening up so that all family members can now simply be involved in both spheres. Since women began to play a significant role in the capitalist mode of production, some of the traditional conditions dissolved. On the one side, this was the potential to overcome oppressive conditions. On the other hand, it goes along with a negative side, namely to a double burden for especially women who had now to combine wage labor and so-called traditional female labor. Nor would the problem be solved just by opening up Hegel's binary model of the heterosexual family to other forms. Although this stands, of course, for progress, the problem is rather that civil society in the sphere of wage labor that serves the production of surplus value is necessarily dependent on the reproductive activities negotiated in the private sphere and at the same time stands in contradiction to them. Rosa Luxemburg aptly emphasizes this aspect in The Accumulation of Capital slightly different. I quote, "The decisive factor is that surplus value can be realized neither by the worker nor by the capitalist, but by social strata or societies that do not themselves produce capitalistically," end of quote. Do I have time? Okay. I'm now going to read out the third part. Marx on family and reproduction. In the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, Marx writes, Hegel's standpoint is that of modern political economy. He grasps labor as the essence of human beings. As the essence of human beings, it stands the test. He sees only the positive, not negative side of labor. Labor is human coming to be for themselves within alienation or as alienated men. The only labor which Hegel knows and recognizes is abstractly mental labor. Marx does not see here that Hegel himself, at least in the System der Sittlichkeit, recognizes the positive as well as the negative side of labor and even describes it as a necessary dialectic of the production process itself. What is decisive, however, is that while Hegel sees alienation as a necessary aspect of objectification in the production process, according to Marx, alienation is something that is not necessarily connected with the production process as such, but only with its concrete historical conditions. I will close my talk in briefly bringing together both dimensions discussed in the first and in the second part, and ask how the ambivalence of division of labor and the contradiction between the family and civil society are intertwined. In order to do so, I will concentrate on Marx's Capital as I try to get into view the relationship between the sphere of production and the sphere of reproduction. As is well known, Marx starts his analysis in Capital with the discussion of commodity and its dual nature, as the commodity appears to us as dual thing, namely as use value and exchange value. But the commodity appears to us as a dual thing because labor itself has a dual nature and contains both abstract and concrete labor, which is specific for the capitalist mode of production. Here Marx writes, "The value form of the product of labor is not only the most abstract, but it is also the most universal form taken by the product in bourgeois production and stamps the production as a particular species of social production and thereby gives it its special historical character. If then we treat this mode of production as one eternally fixed by nature for every state of society, we necessarily overlook that which is the differentia specifica of the value form and consequently of the commodity form and of its further developments, money form, capital form, etc." End of quote. It is also well known that Marx was criticized by a number of feminist theorists who in different ways have accused Marx of focusing too much on production at the expense of reproduction and treating reproduction only as a secondary contradiction. In the following, I will instead briefly like to outline in a preliminary way how production and reproduction in Marx seem to be more complex interrelated. In the chapter on simple reproduction, Marx writes, "Capitalist production, therefore, under its aspect of a continuous connected process, of a process of reproduction, produces not only commodities, not only surplus value, but it also produces and reproduces the capitalist relation. On the one side, the capitalist, on the other, the wage laborer." End of quote. Production and reproduction are not excluding each other, but figure as a dialectical whole. Reproduction here refers not only to the reproduction of living individuals, but also to an essentially social dimension, namely the capitalist relation. But that means that there are not only two opposing spheres, the one of production and the one of reproduction. Rather, production and reproduction, both of capitalist relations and of the individuals in the families, are dialectically moments of the whole. In this passage, Marx obviously is concerned with the reproduction of the capitalist system as a whole and not with the reproductive sphere of the family. It is crucial that this process, nevertheless, is not limited to the sphere of production, but is also effective on the so-called private sphere of the family. That is because reproduction is a physically and socially necessary feature of the accumulation process of the capitalist mode of production. Heather Brown, in her study on family and gender in Marx, is quite clear that Marx is not that much interested in the relations of the private sphere. Although she highlights that the reproduction of labor power and therefore human beings is never just reproduced as merely biological beings, but as being reproduced under specific concrete conditions based on material relationships within a particular society. Therefore, Marx writes, I quote, "If production be capitalist in form, so too will be reproduction. Just as in the former, the labor process appears but as means towards the self-expansion of capital, so in the latter in figure but as means of reproducing as capital, that is, as self-expanding value, the value advanced." End of quote. Marx here seems to be clear that production within the civil legal system is the primary determinant of the sphere of the family and of society as a whole. That is why he is speaking of the capitalist mode of production, where social relations are dictated by the market economy. On the one hand, Marx concentrates on production and on aspects of the family sphere that are directly related to production. On the other hand, he is not ignoring the sphere of reproductive and care labor, but recognizes that this could only truly be understood with regard to production. The family, therefore, cannot be regarded as free from the mode of production, although its principle seems to contradict the principle of the market. Therefore, the so-called private sphere of the family, because it exists outside of wage labor, exists not outside the mode of production. The family is a production relationship in which life, and therefore at least potential commodity of labor power for capital, is produced and reproduced through unpaid subsistence work. Consequently, the sphere of production must therefore only be truly understood with regard to human reproduction and care relationships. But that means that the sphere of the private, or the so-called private, of care, reproductive labor, the familial and sexual relationships is a dialectical moment of the concrete capitalist mode of production as a whole. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Isabel. We have about 30 minutes for questions. So if you have any, raise your hand.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for the great talk. I wanted you to help me with a sort of a question of understanding that has to do with what happens with division of labor in Hegel's philosophy of right, because he doesn't talk so much about it there. And in particular about, I wanted to ask about, what does Hegel say about the satisfaction the worker gets out of their productive activity? For instance, one way of reading the philosophy of right is to say that I get satisfaction through the kind of esteem others people give me for the valuable contribution I make to social cooperation with my developed skills. So in a way, the satisfaction moves from, in some sense, from the actual activity to whether people are willing to pay me a wage for it. And so I get a sense that what I'm doing is meaningful because other people are willing to pay. So is there in the philosophy of right still a place for your own dissatisfaction with your labor, even if you're paid for it? Or is that sort of drops out in the philosophy of right?
Thank you so much for this question. I think I have to think about it. I think compared to the System der Sittlichkeit, you could say that maybe, so I think Hegel, of course, would say you can be dissatisfied with your concrete work. I mean, he makes the division between the concrete labor and the abstract labor there as well. And I think Hegel, he would of course say, yes, of course you can be dissatisfied. But it seems that it's more about understanding it in the way he describes the system of needs, that you, and I think this is maybe the, the aspect what I thought that is a crucial point in the System der Sittlichkeit, that it is about a way of being recognized for what you do. And this is, I think, the progress he wants to highlight, that there is a kind of social formative dimension in labor, because it generates a more a whole. You not just have your individual need. You are you kind of work for, but you work for the whole. It's like a for the social forming. I don't know, but I think I have to think about this now. Thanks.
Thanks for the really helpful talk about, especially the stuff about the philosophy of right. And I just have a clarification question. So if I followed what you were saying, on Hegel's own view, there's a contradiction between the sphere of the family and the sphere of civil society. The nature of that contradiction is such that even if you took away the sexist elements of his account of the family, you would still be left with this contradiction that kind of, I don't know exactly how to put this, it somehow justifies the gendered distribution of labor. Maybe it's no longer a gendered distribution, but it's still a distribution of labor that's still going to be an expression of a contradiction of the fact that some people have to work in the home and some people have to work in civil society. Or I think I was hearing something of that kind of view. And so I wanted just to invite you to say more about how you understand that contradiction between the family and civil society, especially because on at the kind of like granular level, when you're moving from family to the beginning of civil society is an expression of a sublation of a contradiction within the family, right? So it's a form of, and I don't know, I see that they're at a like kind of like more macroscopic level. You know, we have the first immediate form and then the mediation, and there's a kind of otherness, so there's got to be some kind of contradiction. But I wasn't really understanding exactly what the contradiction was on the view you're laying.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So this is exactly what I want to try to understand. So this is really kind of I'm still on. But as I understood it, you're totally right that that civil society that the one in marriage has to enter the stage of civil society is by means that there has to be overcome a certain contradiction within family. So this is totally right. But Hegel, I think he has to stick to the idea that this is just one part. So I think there is something that he must justify this gendered division of labor, because he cannot just simply say that, okay, in the end, both of them can enter the next stage of Sittlichkeit and move to civil society, but there's a reason why one of those partners has to stick to the sphere of the family. And as I understood it, is that he sees that the sphere of the family is the sphere of being dependent, upon the universality of the family. But the sphere of the civil society and the market is to have like an atomistic account of being self-sufficient, self-determined. And at the same, so this is one side maybe to highlight. The other one is that Hegel seems to be very clear that the family and I mean, he's not, as I see it, he's not talking about labor in the family context, but if you want to frame it like that, that sphere of care work or reproductive labor is a prerequisite for one of the partners to enter the next stage. And so there is, yeah, I'm not sure, but I thought that the contradiction is that there are two opposite principles at work within the family and the civil society, but at the same time, the one is the prerequisite for the other. And then it would somehow be, but I'm interested if you maybe see it a different way, but then I would say it could be misleading to say we just soften the idea of Hegel's concept of the family, because I think this is something he recognizes, and this is something that maybe we see nowadays in our society as well, that it's somehow hard for families to combine both spheres. But then the idea, as you just started your question, was exactly that I thought, but should we not take Hegel serious on that point, because he recognizes something very important. But if we do so, it could be, or it seems that not take him serious to say, okay, we just soften this idea of gender division of labor, and then somehow we don't even have to stick to the heterosexual family, but other forms of family, and in the end, it doesn't matter if it's who of the partners is moving to the sphere of civil society, but to say that this is not the way how we can overcome the contradiction. And I thought that that even though it's not very, or as far as I know, not that developed, you can see the interrelation in a different way in Marx, how he treats reproduction and production.
Okay, I have 7 people on the list, and the last 2 questions took about 10 minutes, so...
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's not a problem. It's just to have an idea of what's left.
Thank you. So I want to find out how materialistic your Hegel reconstruction is, because in the first part, in the Hegel part, you mentioned the machine, I think, only once. Yeah, and I like this passage when he say that the workers step back, yeah, zurücktreten from the machinery, and this makes the workers not replaceable only with regard to other workers, this too, but with regard to the machinery. Yeah, and I think this is also what Marx pushes very much, that the machine becomes more and more like a craftsman, and the worker become like a machine in the mechanistical reproduction, yeah. And so, is this important? I mean, also in your Marx reconstruction, that there is a mechanical moment in the form of production and also reproduction, and would this not a link? I mean, also coming back to this first part and saying both think work, the work in the production through the machinery. And this means that the machinery becomes more and more human in a way, and the human becomes less human in this mechanical way. So is this a dialectical twist? It's also interesting for your approach.
Thanks. Yeah, this is very interesting, but I think this was kind of so preliminary that I would not even say that I did like have a really good reconstruction of the Marx part right now. So this is because, this is just now very preliminary. But of course, and this is very interesting, maybe this is linked to that as well, the passages where Marx addresses the machines are the passages where he's talking about the family and of why women are now allowed to go to the factories and work and so on. So I think this is, of course, it is very important. So thank you for telling me. I will think about it.
Okay, thank you so much. I think my question is quite related to Andy's question before. So this kind of contradiction that is in place, but maybe expressed from the other side. So what's the irreducible function of the family? So you're suggesting, in a certain sense, those two spheres are irreducible. We need both. So the contradiction is interesting because both are needed. Because otherwise we could say, well, let's not to have families anymore and to just be in civil society or something like that. And so the question that I have is how to explain or account for the irreducibility of the family. So why is this an irreducible form of spirituality that we cannot do without? And what other element of, what other kind of manifestation of my freedom is present there? So it would help me if you could say some more on this. And just to explain the need to say more maybe is the way you portrayed civil society. You portrayed it as a system of needs, and labor mediates the satisfaction of needs. So it seems that in some sense or form, civil society takes us up as natural beings and takes care of our needs, right? So it could seem as if, so I mean, it's all very familiar to us that in civil society we work, we expand our living forces, and then we need to reproduce somewhere, and we need to be fed, and then rest, and get back on our feet so that we can labor again, right? And so we do this other thing in the family. But if the civil society is a system of needs, well, those needs for rest should be taken care of there as well. So I mean, yeah, and you can on the market get an apartment, get a massage, and so on. So the question is, why? So in what sense, or like what maybe can put our finger on this? So what's so irreducible about the family? Because I think we would need this in place for us to see more clearly what is kind of lacking in the model of civil society, right? And I mean, one further aspect of this is you were portraying it a little bit like, well, the social aspect or the universality is present in the family, let's say, takes precedence, residence in civil society. It's all about the individuals and how they interact. But Hegel also says civil society, well, it has two principles, the individual and the universal. Just the universal obliquely realizes itself through the systematicity of the needs, so through the way in which the needs interlock. So it would help me if you could say what you think is so irreducible about the family, what aspect of or what mode of reproduction is present there that you could never integrate within civil society, because the neoliberal agenda is make everything like civil society, right? And have this understanding of autonomy then as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very good question. I'm not sure if I can answer very well on that question, but I thought that the crucial point in Hegel is that, I mean, he sees that, or it seems to be clear that this is that civil society he has in mind is a concrete, historical grown form of civil society, and within those concrete forms of the way or the mode of production, it seems that in order to get that mode of production working, there needs to be something that that is not included in the market itself. So that provides the value for the market, but is not integrated in the market. But this is how I thought one could reconstruct Hegel on that point. But of course, this does not answer the question about the agenda maybe to just overcome family structure and integrate everything in civil society or in the market, as you just proposed. So I'm not sure how to relate Hegel on that, but I would like to stick to something that that says that within family, let's call it like the private sphere, something is necessary and this is just, maybe I have to be clear, so the irreducibility of the family or this sphere is first only for this concrete way civil society is organized. So it could be that if civil society is overcome and that different forms of organization, maybe family has a different value, or maybe could be integrated. Those sphere of care and reproductive labor could be integrated otherwise in society. So, yeah.
Thank you. That was very interesting, and we already discussed it, and I like it. And my question is maybe linking back what you say in the introduction, because you start out with this problem of freedom, and then you go on with Lukács and something like the dialectics of labor, and the ambivalency, as you called it, of labor division. And I was wondering, one way to read the labor division development, how Lukács describes it, would be there is no dialectics because it's a technological progress, but it's a decline of freedom, at least for most individuals. So would you say that there is a dialectics of freedom at work? Because when Marx, as you quote him, says Hegel is only seeing the positive side of labor, you stress the negative side of labor with System der Sittlichkeit, and I like that, and that's why I'm asking: is there also some progress of freedom? Maybe also linking it with the question of why do we need the family? Why do we need this sort of civil society with the family reproducing the labor power and so on? So is there also a dialectics of freedom that you see, or how to think about freedom or autonomy, discontents, and labor, the way that you described it?
Thank you, Alexei. So maybe I'm wrong, but I thought that Hegel is really seeing a dialectics of freedom at work within the division of labor. So I think maybe I was not clear enough on that. But I thought that at first what he does in the System der Sittlichkeit is to see that within the social division of labor, there's something at work that it's like the increasing productivity he's discussing with regard to Adam Smith, and the way I'm working not only for my individual need, but for the need of society, and what he calls, I had this great pleasure for all pleasure, and not just my pleasure, and so on. So I thought this is one positive side he's emphasizing, but he sees that this way of an increasing way of freedom is necessarily combined with those negative aspects or degradation dimension. And so I thought that one could say that he is explicitly on the positive and the negative sides of labor. And what is so interesting, and I thought this is something that Lukács as well highlighted, that it is so interesting that he says it's not just a privation within that form of society, and we can keep on producing, or we can keep on producing like this, and just get the negative sides away, and then everything is fine, and we have just the perfect way of division of labor in that sense. But he's aware of that there is this objective increasing freedom we have on the one side, but on the other side, we can't get away from that negative dimensions. So I thought one could, but of course, this is just maybe one way to frame it. Whether I'm, of course, yeah, I think this is one thing I would highlight. But I think you were drawing on the way I see that in Marx as well, or was that? No, okay, perfect. Thanks.
So we did start 10 minutes late. I just want to confirm we can go 10 minutes over. We can be 10 minutes late for lunch.
Yeah, some of us have to be at a place very close in 1:15. So.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I loved it, and I found very, very good how you stressed how much critique of civil society we can get already with Hegel and in the division of labor and working in parts that are not so visible in the Rechtsphilosophie by adding these other aspects of the work. And I relate a bit to the question of Thomas with regard to the connection between family and civil society, but adding a bit the Marxian perspective here, because I had the impression they had a slightly different idea of how these spheres are related, where with Hegel we get the diagnosis that can be seen as a perfect reconstruction of how, in fact, capitalism works, that we need different spheres that work differently, and capitalism needs both. So it needs the love in the family, and the care, and the softness, and so on, in order for the harshness and exploitative dimension within civil society to work. So in fact, it produces both spheres in their difference, and this contrast or contradiction is actually productive. So it's necessary for the whole to function. So this seems to be what Hegel sees. And what in Marx is visible is that in fact also the sphere of reproduction is capitalized. So it's not that different so it's not a completely different logic from the logic of the market, but the capitalization enters also the sphere of the family. And I was wondering how you would connect these two slightly different diagnoses. So do we need both? Is this the trajectory of your talking about Hegel and Marx, saying, okay, we need both see different things, but we need both diagnoses, or how would you relate them?
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is at the heart of the idea what I was drawing on. So yeah, perfect. That's exactly how I thought we have to understand Hegel, what you were just reconstructing. And so I thought that what we can get in going on to see how production and reproduction is related in Marx is to see that Hegel is not getting this dimension into view. He is recognizing something. He's recognizing that there's a contradiction in our concrete social relations, but he's not making explicit that the family, although it is deeply interwoven with the whole production process, he's not making explicit how they are related, although they work on principles that are contradicted. So there's a contradiction, and at the same time, it seems that he's clear that the family is necessary in order for the market to work, to flow. And then I thought the idea could be to say, okay, let's take Hegel serious, but what becomes more explicit is the way in which Marx frames those dimensions, namely to see that the family dimension within civil society is deeply influenced, and not just a different sphere, but they are interwoven. And then one could say this is just one historical concrete option to frame this relationship, but because Hegel seems to be clear that, or it seems that Hegel is not after a radical transformation of social relations and so on, but maybe this is something one can get out from the different framing within those two dimensions in Marx. That was the idea, but yeah. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. My question depends on whether I understood correctly how you reconstructed Hegel and Marx. I'll try to make it brief for the sake of time. I understood it such that you reconstructed Marx as thinking that alienation and the reification of workers being tied to the historically specific mode of production in capitalism, whereas Hegel thought this alienation and the how do you say, Widersprüche tied to being integral to societal work per se. And thus Hegel putting no hope in the transformation of production, while Marx puts the entire hope in this transformation. And if I understood this correctly, how do you explain the shift in views between Hegel and Marx, and what advantage, theoretical advantage or insight does Marx have that Hegel didn't to make this new assessment?
Thank you. I think Hegel is a bit ambivalent, as I understood him, because on the one hand, it's totally correct. I said that in the talk that it seems that Hegel sees alienation as a necessary condition of labor, and especially social dimension of labor. But at the same time, he's clear that that this is true for the concrete, historically grown way our society works. So I think this seemed to be a bit ambivalent, while Marx seems to make the point, or recognizes, and this is a point that Lukács also highlights, that Marx recognizes that alienation, or is more clear about that alienation is just a dimension of labor, because we have labor in this concrete way our society is organized. But I think I'm not completely sure on Hegel and how the shift of perspective, because I think one could highlight both dimensions in Hegel. One could say he must be clear that he is clear that alienation is just not a necessary dimension of social labor, but at the same time, it seemed to me that sometimes it seems that he sees it as a necessary dimension. So I think it's a bit ambivalent. I'm not really, I'm not totally sure about how to understand that.
Okay, we have really tight 5 minutes. I would collect the last 3 questions, if you can keep them very brief, and then perhaps the conversation can continue over lunch.
So thank you very much. I enjoyed a lot your talk. I will try to be very, very brief. So which sense do you make of the conception that the corporation is the second family? So it's a little bit in line with the question of the nature and the limits of the necessity of the family in the philosophy of right. So can a corporation assume some tasks of reproduction, and in that direction, couldn't we not attribute to Hegel a more ambitious conception of social rights than only to provide a minimum standard? Not just a minimum standard, but also maybe he is already pointing to some kind of common experience, a universal service that can really have this role of satisfying the reproductive necessities of society. So.
I was very intrigued by 2 elements of your talk. The one was when you said that the family, and it was quoted already, that the family, you can't just get over it. There is some, maybe functional is not the right word, but there's some aspect of it and some problem that keeps coming again. And the other was when you said, or quoted, that Hegel is criticizing Kant for seeing the ethical as something which is contractual. I'm wondering now, if we look at the ethical in this respect, to say that family maybe is the most natural form of the ethical, because there, in the beginning too, then even more people share a life out of free will. The question would be, what is the ethical dimension of the civil society? And then the question of the contractual comes into it, because it seems as if the division of labor seems to be another dimension of the ethical, not the most natural, the shared life you have in the family, but a shared social life that comes exactly with what you described, that you produce for the other. And then the contractual seems to have a certain ambivalent role in this, because on the one hand, it seems to be the perfect instrument for having this kind of social relation to each other, share a common life, being dependent on each other, but in a way that still allows you to do this freely. But on the other hand, you have all this kind of perversions, changes, alienation, and so on and so forth. So if you take serious that ethical life can't be built on something like the contract, could there be an alternative of having exactly this dimension of the ethical life that civil society is without having the contract? So I wouldn't go the way that Thomas and Francesca proposed to you, to see it in a more instrumental fashion, but really see these different dimensions of the ethical and then come to terms with that somehow, because it seems to be irreducible in the family as well as in civil society.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, 1 minute left for...
Yeah, only one word. I wanted to go back to the question of Thomas and perhaps Francesca and so. And I was thinking to the element of irreducibility of family, and I wanted to ask you if we can find something in this direction in the notion of personality and also Persönlichkeit. That is the principle that finds its building into the family, but it is the principle that destroys family. And so personality seems to me to be a sort of possibility in order to see in what sense family is irreducible, but in what sense family is to be superseded. From this point of view, I don't know if it makes sense, but this is an idea.
So we are done with time. No, I don't know. I'm okay. We are. Maybe this can continue over lunch, and join me to thank Isabel for her talk.